Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again from Film Fanatic. It is a Sunday at about 10:30. Hope everyone's doing good. Yesterday was a pretty nice day for a change. We have sporadically we have some nice days. We last weekend Sunday or a week ago was a gorgeous day. It turned out to be really nice. Originally, it wasn't going to be nice. That was our last quantum show that we just had, and that day ended up being beautiful. But all week and part of Friday, but Saturday, yesterday was a super nice day. I had a gig all the way up in Ripley, Maine, which I had never been to before. Ripley's a pretty remote area. It's an amazing, beautiful drive. It's south of Augusta. It's really, really inland. It's almost by Harmony, Maine, which is like pretty much super inland. It's almost as inland as you can get. I never been up through that part of the state before. It's a weird thing. I have like a mixed feeling about when I travel through places like that. It's kind of odd. Overall, like when I discover places like that, or I'm on my through my travels. Like one good example is my favorite place to go, which I need to go because I haven't been there in a while, and I'm gonna probably go this week or next weekend because I'll have some time. But my favorite place to go, which I've talked about a billion times, is Bull Moose Music, and I go to the one in. I usually go to the two locations that one is in Waterville, Maine, and the other one is in Bangor. And the last time I went was in Bangor, and that was probably about maybe a month or so ago, maybe a little bit more. So it's my home away from home. I love that place to death. And I used to always go up. Basically, I'd get on Route One, on kind of the main drag for both trips when I would go. And they're kind of boring trips. You know, you're on the highway most of the time. You make probably a little bit more, a little bit better time, I guess, getting there. Takes just about an hour, give or take 5 or 10 minutes. But I started using my GPS to basically kind of explore maybe the idea of finding a different way to get up there that would be maybe a little bit quicker and a little bit more of a enjoyable ride. So I started doing that, and the especially both trips are really nice now. But especially when I go to Augusta, I take all of these back roads up through Unity, Maine, and it's a gorgeous trip. I really love going up there. There's all these beautiful farms, lots of great uh, giant fields. It's a real beautiful area. And then the same thing. There's a couple of spots. I take a little bit of a different route now when I go to Bangor, and the same thing there. It's a pretty beautiful trip. There's not really anybody around, and it's beautiful country basically. And yesterday when I went to Ripley for the first time, I was literally in the sticks, and I was using my GPS, but I was at one point. It's an hour and 15 minutes from here, from my house here in Northport, and about, I don't know, 50 minutes into the trip, 45 minutes into the trip, I was using my GPS. The GPS is pretty reliable, and so I was. But at one point, I was like, I don't know, second guessing where I was because I wasn't seeing any signs or indications. I knew I was going in the right direction, but I was getting a little nervous that maybe I, somehow got, somehow I was going the wrong way. So it was funny. I stopped. I can't even remember where it was. It was like maybe 35 minutes from where the gig was, and I stopped at this little diner or a little gas station, and there was nothing. I literally, it was the only place I passed during my whole trip. It was the only gas station I saw. It was the only store I saw. So for like an hour and 15 minutes, I didn't see anything around. Nothing. There was absolutely nothing. You do go through Skowhegan, which is a pretty populated area, and there's buildings there. But this was like even on the outskirts of that, and Skowhegan was you could see it off in the distance. You don't really go through it, but the whole trip was, there was nothing around. So I was a little bit nervous that maybe I was going the wrong way. I just wanted to double check. So I stopped at this diner or this gas station, and I just figured I would just ask, just make sure everybody like, hey, so I was just curious. I'm using my GPS. I'm trying to get to this place, Ripley, Maine. I just wanted to double check. It says, according to the GPS, that I'm like 35 minutes away, and I was just, just making sure, talk to an actual human being, making sure I'm going in the right direction. And if not, then I'd have to, calibrate or re Google the address for some reason. But I thought it was okay. But for safety's sake, I decided to just stop and make sure, because there was nothing around, and I knew I was driving further and further into where there was nothing, even less around. So I stopped in this store, and it was really busy. There were all these kids in there. They were coming back from swimming, and they were all getting pizza and soda, and it was like literally a line of these kids. And I saw a guy in the back who worked in the deli, and I asked him, "So, do you have an idea how far Ripley is from here?" And he had no idea what Ripley was. He was just like, "I have no idea where that is." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And then so he asked his brother, who also worked there, and these guys were like, hardcore Mainers. They had, the strong Maine accents, and, they were like weathered people, and they were very nice. And his brother had no idea either. And I was just like, oh, geez, okay. And then there were three or four people waiting in line, and then there was another woman in the back who worked there, this older woman. And she's like, yeah, I do know where that is, but you're like super far away. And I was like, how far do you think is your estimate that how far that I actually am? And she's like, oh no, you're like really, really far. You got a long ways to go. And I said, well, my GPS says 34 minutes. And she's like, no, it's really, really far. Like, and I started to get nervous. I thought, okay, so maybe I screwed up and I am going in the wrong direction. But then there was a couple that was getting groceries and food and stuff, and they knew where Ripley was. They knew exactly where it was, and they were saying, "No, no, no, you're in the right direction." And they're like, they gave me these directions, but then I said, "No, I'm using my GPS. I just wanted to get my bearings and make sure I'm going in the right direction." And they they're like, "Yep, you're about 34 minutes away." So I was like, "Okay, cool." So then I took off and drove, and I found the place, and it was totally remote. It's on this lake, where the party was that I was playing at, and beautiful, beautiful spot, amazing spot. The house is gorgeous. It was a really fun party. Got home pretty late, but it was a long day, but it was super fun, and but it's funny because it's you know on one hand, it's a beautiful it was a beautiful scenic drive, and it's gorgeous. There's all these great farms, beautiful farms, and big green grass everywhere, and big fields, and nice all kinds of woods. And it's interesting because it was like the whole trip was like that. And I got there around 2:30, or no, I should say I got there about 3:15, and the gig started at 6. And then when I got there, I just kind of hung out, and I beat the rest of the band there. One of the guys that was coming, I played a gig with Troy Youngblood, Dan Miller, and Al Crichton, and they're just super cool guys and really talented. And I've been playing some gigs with those guys, and so I beat them. And one of the guys, Troy, had messaged the guy who was hosting the party, or texted him, or called him, saying he was lost, and he was about 20 minutes away, but he eventually showed up. Really 10 minutes away. He was only 10 minutes away, really. But and then on the ride back, we packed up and we played for quite a while, and we played the gig, and then we packed up, and then by the time I got home last night was about um, quarter after midnight or so. So it was a pretty long day, but it was super fun, and it was a great gig, and those guys are a blast, and it's real loose, the kind of the music that they do, and there's not a lot of preset kind of things that we do. So, but when I came back, when I was driving back, I'm like, I had this totally different kind of feeling come over me on the way back. I'm like, wow, how do people live here? Like, it's so isolated. Like, it's so isolated and so desolate, where there's not even a convenience store. Like, where do people even go to go grocery shopping? Or like if they want to like, go to a shop and get a cup of coffee, or like, go to a movie, or like, go see, go to a, just go to your, to a local bar, or with your friend or your friends, or just some kind of social thing. And I'm like, there's nothing around here. Like, and then on the way back, I took a little bit of a different route on the way back, and I passed this big high school, or this big giant middle school, and I think it was also a high school, but it was this big school, and I didn't pass it going because I came back a little bit of a different route. And I was like, the first thought I had in my mind was like, wow, how that's an interesting life it must be up here for the kids that go to the school. And it was a big school, and I'm like, what that I wonder what that's like for the kids here. I mean, they grew up here, they're conditioned to like living in this really desolate, quiet area. But I wonder, like, do do the kids get depressed, or do they get too overwhelmed with the idea of being isolated here, or maybe they're just conditioned, you know, so well to that environment that they don't really even think of it as being a thing. And it's a funny thing because after driving there, I had this totally different feeling of like, wow, this is kind of depressing driving through here. There's like nothing around, you know. So it was interesting going there and having this really beautiful kind of feeling going there, but then coming back and it was kind of like, wow, I could not live in this kind of an area or this kind of environment. And I know it's all situational, but and personal, but because of where I really love where I live because I live in Northport, but it's centralized. I can go to Belfast, I can go to Camden, I can go to Rockland. I'm in the middle of all of the areas that there's things to do. There's restaurants, there's bars, there's movie theaters. There's plenty of things to go to, plenty of places to go to meet if you want to do a social thing, to go shopping or whatever, just daily life kind of thing, kinds of things. There's plenty of those options. There's almost more than enough. There's tons of places around here, and I'm like in the middle, and at the same time I'm really close to the ocean, but I can drive half a mile away from here and be in complete isolation, which I do love, and be totally in the woods and by the water. So it's a cool balance of that. But people that live in an area like that where it's so remote and you have to drive an hour to just maybe go to a convenience store or go shopping. Jeez. But anyway, it's interesting. It's an interesting you know um, kind of environment to like live in, especially I would imagine if you're a kid, but or to be raised in that area. I don't know. It's interesting. And I know for me, if I lived in that area, just the idea of like if I wanted to go to say I needed to do grocery shopping, where the hell do you go? Where do what are your options? You have to like plan a day, a good couple of hours to do that. It's or and anything else, at least from what I saw, going out to a bar with your friends or going out to eat, getting takeout, maybe go to a movie or go out bowling. That's like that's even more of a thing and more of a chore. I don't know. But anyway, so I have been again watching tons of movies. I have been really, really loving movies. I've gotten through most of the movies I went on a big buying frenzy of movies the last month or two. I went on some big splurges. I went to Bull Moose about a month ago. Bought a bunch of great movies. I did reviews for all of those films that I bought. Amazing purchases. And then I made a big splurge. I went to Goodwill in Rockland, and I got a really great batch of movies there. And then that same week, Opera House Video had done had a really giant movie sale, and I bought a ton of movies there. So, and those two big sales, or those all of those big purchases all happened like pretty much within a 2 week period. So I had a ton of movies. I literally had a stack on my table of movies, and I was going through all of them. I watched, and I pretty much watched all of them. There's a few Blu-rays I bought that I just haven't been, super duper in the mood yet to watch them. I will eventually watch them, but the movies I was really, really excited to see, and the movies I really wanted to see, I did see, and I did reviews on all of them, and a lot of great films, a lot of great discoveries too. I discovered a whole slew of some really awesome slasher movies that I had never discovered. One in particular that I can think of off the top of my head is this Canadian slasher movie called Curtains, which is so badass. And so it was very, very cool. Um, Very, very cool. I made a lot of great, wonderful discoveries. Saw some films I hadn't seen in many, many years. One in particular, another one I can think of is the original Puppet Master, which is just a masterpiece. So it was great. And so I'm itching to go back and to buy some stuff. It's been about a month or so. Got a little bit extra cash on me, so I'm gonna do some buying maybe this week or weekend. So I'm excited about that prospect. So stay tuned for probably some newer Blu-ray, DVD purchases. But today is on, and so in the meantime, I still have, or I should say, in my downtime of buying movies, I have tons of movies that I still want to get to. I have, a pretty big collection, so I always go through them and think mentally about, okay, maybe this is a movie I've been meaning to talk about. Or no, I really want to get to that one. So that's kind of where my head has been at lately. And when I do that, I realize, wow, like there's a whole world of other movies that I want to talk about. So today is about a classic that has been talked about so much. And again, it's one of those things, what can I add to it to make it interesting? But it's such a classic, and I think it's easily one of the scariest movies ever made, arguably the scariest horror movie ever made. And that is William Friedkin's The Exorcist. This movie, I just think, is a pure masterpiece. This movie came out in 1973. It's hard to believe. It stars Linda Blair. It's hard to believe that this movie has been out for as long uh, as it's been. It stars Linda Blair, Ellen Bernstein, Jason Miller, and the fabulous Max von Sydow. And this was directed by William Friedkin. This came out in 1973. And I've seen this movie again. Like, this movie has been talked about and has been given the accolades that it deserves over the years, because this movie is, I just think, without a doubt, one of the most terrifying movies ever made, but then also one of the most just like in your face experiences you can have as a horror fan. And and the whole like genre or kind of explosion of movies, of horror movies that involve people being possessed by demons or the devil. That has been that whole kind of genre or even a subgenre has like exploded in the last 15 years or so. And this came out in 73. So there's like so many movies that deal with possession. And this movie was pretty much the one of the first, if not the first film to tackle that. And this film is famously based off of the classic novel, William Peter Blatty's novel, The Exorcist, which is actually a really awesome book. It's terrifying. There are a few sequences in the book that were not in the movie that are just spine tingling, but they William Friedkin did such an amazing job with this with this film and the adaptation. And William Friedkin, I think my favorite decades of that I always go back to are the 70s and 80s. And William Friedkin, in the 70s, it was the height of his power. He was one of the greatest, you know, directors ever. He made all these really gritty movies like The French Connection and so many great movies. He's always been one of my favorites. And this is probably the biggest movie of his entire career that I would say. And again, like I've seen this movie talked about many times even to this day. But and a lot of the times I see, well, like one list in particular I saw fairly recently. There it was around usually around Halloween time. There's a lot of YouTube guys and girls that have horror YouTube channels, and they always talk about, or they'll do a special on top 10 or top 20 or top 5 uh, scariest movies of all time. And The Exorcist, about 9 times out of 10, is usually like number 2 or number 1. Other movies that get mentioned a lot are films like, one movie I think is really right up there is Takashi Miike's The Audition. I think that movie is so frightening and disturbing. I would say for my money that those two films, when you just look at it for face value, are probably the most legitimately scary films that you can see. I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, is another one that's actually frightening, a frightening movie. I also feel Ridley Scott's Alien. I think that movie is so creepy and scary at times, as well as The Exorcist and The Audition. The Shining is another movie I feel like is one of the scariest movies ever made. I did a big show on The Shining recently. I think that's one of the scariest movies. Movies that really, and being that horror is my favorite genre. There's different levels to the horror experience. Obviously, you have movies like the Evil Dead franchise, and then you have a lot of great, all of the wonderful horror exploitation movies. I feel like a lot of those movies have a creep factor, and they're really they can be really disturbing, and they can be really intense experiences, and they can just be a good ride. They can be just fun and like a thrill ride. I think Halloween, John Carpenter's the original, is a pretty scary movie. I think The Thing, John Carpenter's, I think for me, for my money, the greatest John Carpenter movie. I think that movie is legitimately scary and like really gets under your skin. And there's lots of horror movies that are really good and amazing and are super entertaining, and they're creepy. They have this amazing atmosphere. But then there's also other movies, other horror movies that really legitimately legitimately get under your skin, and you where you're actually kind of scared. And I think so. There's a little bit of a difference, There's a little bit of a difference, and I think sometimes those movies, like The Exorcist or like The Audition, like I said, they kind of just maybe I don't know, to a degree, strike a little bit more of a like a primal nerve in your brain, and it just gets under your skin, and there's something about it that I don't know is linked to having a nightmare at night, and it just really gets into your lizard brain, and it stays with you, and it can kind of haunt you. And I think The Exorcist, I think it's easy to say, probably overall, and it's been talked about and has been heralded as being the greatest. But I kind of feel like it probably is all around, all overall, probably the scariest movie ever made. I think overall, like it went as a film, it went into places that we don't see today. It really pushed the envelope. It really has this realism to it that is kind of unparalleled. I've talked with people about, you know, who this came out in 73, and I've talked with people who saw it in the theater. And I remember, you always hear those stories of where people, this movie was very controversial. It was also a mega, mega, mega blockbuster. Uh, and I've always heard those stories that people say that when The Exorcist originally came out, people, who saw it in the theater were, throwing up and like running out of the theater screaming and, and all these things and just like screaming and crying and, getting all just freaking out, losing their minds over this movie. And I talked to a couple of people who saw The Exorcist, and I thought, okay, maybe that's partially true, or maybe it's just a gross exaggeration. But I've talked to a few people who saw The Exorcist in the theater when it came out, like when it premiered, and according to their stories, they said that that was a lot of those cases were true, where people were like running out of the theater during certain scenes that would happen. They were running out of the theater, or even examples of like people actually throwing up in the aisles. And that's an intense experience. Like that is wild. I think, and for me, I would have loved to have seen The Exorcist, during that time, especially things were a little bit more conservative then, so it would have been interesting. But I think of there are some newer, more modern films that I feel have that same kind of thing of where it really gets under your skin, and they are legitimately scary. Two movies that I can think of off the top of my head is Ari Aster's Hereditary. That movie has some moments in it where I think it is generally scary. Like it really gets it. It still does. I love that movie to death. Ari Aster is one of my favorite directors right now. Did Midsummer, and he's got a newer film with Joaquin Phoenix that I can't think of the name of. Um, but I remember the first time I saw Hereditary. There were moments of that film, certain sequences that legitimately freaked me out and kind of scared me. It was just, you know, and it had that '70s vibe. And I've even seen reviews of where people, were comparing it to The Exorcist, and I think it's kind of cut from the same cloth, where it just goes into places. It really goes into uncharted territory. It tackles taboos. It shows you things that you thought you would never see on the big screen. It addresses issues even to a degree that you thought you would never see uh, be explored on the big screen. But then also doing it in this way of where it's still entertaining. And I think Hereditary is an amazing film for that. And the other film I feel that where I had that same kind of impact, or it had that same kind of impact on me, especially when I first saw it, is The Babadook. The first time I saw The Babadook, that really freaked me out. particularly around the sequences with the mother character who is like really losing her mind. I just thought that was just so frightening. And again, that movie really reminded me of kind of the classic 70s filmmaking style. So, it's amazing. And it's funny on the flip side of things, I know a girl that I used to work with and she's probably like 27, 28, and she had never seen The Exorcist, and I used to work with her about a year ago. And she's into movies and stuff, and she's not really into horror movies, but she's into movies, and she's got a pretty good she had a pretty big open mind, and she again had never seen The Exorcist, and she said that she had heard all the stories over the years saying that this movie was the most terrifying thing ever seen, and those kinds of things. And I had said, yeah, that I mean, it's a iconic classic. I mean, it really is. It's one of the greatest movies ever made. Not only one of the greatest horror movies ever made, but I just think it's the best thing William Friedkin's ever done as an amazing director. It's also, I think, a masterpiece as outside of it being a horror film. And so she saw it. She watched it on Netflix or something. And she told me the next day after she saw it, and she didn't like it at all. She thought it was, you know, overhyped and not that scary, and it was predictable, and she just kind of lambasted it, and just kind of trashed it. And I was kind of like, what? And again, people can have their opinions, but I kind of felt that was a thing with, like, it was a generational factor because this film doesn't have, like, maybe the typical jump scares that kids now or younger people are accustomed to when they see horror films. It's a slow movie. The Exorcist was done in '73. Typically, a lot of American films, and which they were very influenced by a lot of European films, but they have a slower pace. So it doesn't have that, flashy kind of editing. So I don't know. Maybe it was a generational thing, but it was pretty funny. I've had people say that too about my favorite film of all time, The Godfather, where they say it's too boring, there's not enough violence, it's overrated, and it's like, not what people say it is. And I'm just like, what? It's a masterpiece. It's kind of like, saying, to me, it's kind of like saying, I sometimes make these analogies, but to me, it's like saying, well, I really say love, um, funk music. I'm a big fan of funk music, but I'm not really into James Brown, or I'm not, really into Parliament. But everything else is good. But I'm not. I don't really like those guys. To me, it's like, no, that's like probably the most. Those are the two most important, historical figures, in that style. And it doesn't make any sense how you could disregard that and still love a certain style. Um, it just, or it's almost like saying, well, I love rock and roll. I grew up listening to rock and roll. I love rock and roll music, but Led Zeppelin, I don't really like him that much. It doesn't. I don't get that, but it's almost that same kind of thing. The other interesting thing about this movie, and again, I don't have it on Blu-ray, which I need to get eventually, but I have this really awesome DVD special edition. There's two versions of the film. There was the theatrical cut that came out in '73, and then there was the director's cut that came out about, I think it was about 10 years ago now, maybe more. But there was a limited release. There was a director's cut of The Exorcist that came out in the theater, and I do prefer the director's cut. I always, again, I've said many times, most of the time I go back and I watch the director's cuts of certain films, and I find myself enjoying them more. They usually have certain sequences in the films that are unedited. There's a little bit more. It gives you a little bit more inclusion into the storyline, and I just prefer the director's cuts over the theatrical cuts. 9 times out of 10. Examples of that would be the the Alien movies. Ridley Scott's the director's cut, I think, is far superior compared to the theatrical cut. James Cameron's Aliens, far superior to the theatrical cut. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, the Redux, the director's cut, far superior than the theatrical cut. There's many, many examples of that, and I think that this is another example of that. There are whole like sequences that were cut out for various reasons, probably through the studio because of the length of the movie, or maybe you know other people were making decisions. And those theatrical cuts that I mentioned of those films are still really, really awesome, but the director's cuts of those films is just at a whole nother level, I think. The director's cut of The Exorcist, there are a few scenes in this film that were cut out that are truly unsettling and amazing. So I highly recommend, if you've never seen the director's cut of The Exorcist, definitely go see it. The other weird thing too about this, or interesting thing, is that this film was based on William Peter Blatty's book. I read the book, and the book is really great. There's a lot of great special features on here. There's a really awesome and a very interesting interview with William Friedkin and William Peter Blatty, and they talk about their process. But the thing is that's funny and kind of off-putting, I guess, but William Peter Blatty literally believes in this whole notion of possession, and that there is this red devil figure with a pitchfork and horns, and that there are these, and that he isn't, in charge of, all of these minions of demons that can possess people. And he believes literally in the devil and good and evil, and that these stories, because supposedly this story was based on a true life account of this girl who had this case of possession. That was the inspiration for the book. And so, but William Peter Blatty believes in these legitimate forces of good and evil, and believes in a literal Satan and a literal God. And listening to him talk about these things, it's a little bit hard to take. It's a little bit hard to understand and comprehend, because I think it's all mythology and it's all make believe. And if anyone has to believe or does believe in the idea that there is a supreme Christian God, or some supreme evil being incarnate that is responsible for all the horrible things in the world, we live in, our culture is predominantly, of course, or unfortunately, Christian Judeo. It's a Christian Judeo society we live in. That is the dominant. Those are the two dominant religions. But anybody who firmly believes in that mythology, that these things are in a literal, literally exist, all they have to do is pick up a book and read, books about, or read stories of the classic Viking sagas, things that were happening in Greenland, and Norwegian culture, or read books on ancient Greece or ancient Egypt, all these different cultures, Native American cultures, throughout the millennia. And they can see, with a rational mind, and you don't have to be an intellectual to understand that, all of these things have been a part of our society. And what the Christian or Judeo stance is not anything inherently different. it's a little bit more, I think, to a degree, more serious or kind of alarming or terrifying, because there seems to be this belief that what they believe in per se is the way, and that, and it has no room for science in any way, shape, or form. So anybody who believes that, all they have to do is like look throughout the period of history and see that these archetypes have existed forever, and there is a beauty in it. There is a commonality that on how people are all connected, but essentially what these entities or these myths, these are all just representations of kind of the collective human experience, and it just they just represent more or less the trials and tribulations and the yearnings of being human, and that's it. To look at it in the literal sense, that they're not merely a reflection of the human experience, and to look at the idea that, well, no, they are literal, and in a literal, these are literal deities incarnate, is just, I think, completely insane. So, but that's just me. So, but I cannot recommend this movie enough, especially the director's cut. William Friedkin's The Exorcist, amazing, amazing movie. Pound for pound, I would say probably the scariest movie ever made. So this is Jason Dean, and thanks again for checking out this channel, and we will see you next time. Peace.